When the legendary George Burns passed away at 100 years old, he didn't just leave behind a legacy of cigars and deadpan wit.
Aren't you going to blow out the candles?
I'm lucky if I can get my cigar into my holder.
He left behind a massive multi-million-dollar fortune. While many expected his estate to be divided among Hollywood charities or his extended family, the reality was far more shocking. After decades of stardom and savvy investments, the Sunshine Boy made a final move that stunned everyone. So who was the secret beneficiary who walked away with everything? Join us as we reveal the one person who inherited the Burns legacy. From Lower East Side poverty to comedy legend, the story of George Burns. Long before the world knew him as the cigar-holding comedian with the slow smile and razor-sharp timing, George Burns had no fortune, no investments, and certainly no millions tied to his name. The man who would eventually leave behind one of the most surprising inheritances in Hollywood history started out as a skinny kid named Nathan Birnbaum, just trying to survive on New York's Lower East Side. He was born on January 20th, 1896, in a crowded tenement in New York City, the third of 12 children born to Orthodox Jewish immigrants Louis Philip and Dora Bluth Birnbaum. Their world was small, loud, and constantly in motion. At first, the entire family squeezed into a single room. Later, when things improved slightly, they moved into a 3-room cold water flat. Burns's father worked long hours in a kosher butcher shop and sang as a cantor at the synagogue. Music, faith, and survival were tangled together in that household. But everything changed in 1903 when the influenza epidemic swept through New York City. George Burns was only 7 years old when his father died. Overnight, the weight of the family fell onto the shoulders of his mother, Eliza Birnbaum, who suddenly had 12 children to raise on her own in one of the toughest neighborhoods in the city. Childhood ended quickly in that environment. Back then, the boy everyone called Natty didn't have the luxury of dreaming about show business. He had to work, so he did whatever he could. He shined shoes, ran errands for shopkeepers, and sold newspapers on the street. It wasn't easy. It was survival. Then, almost by accident, something unexpected happened. At 7 years old, Burns found a job in a local candy shop making chocolate syrup. It was sticky, boring work. But down in the basement, he and a few other boys found a way to pass the time. When they got tired of stirring syrup, they started singing together, practicing harmonies just to entertain themselves. One day, their mail carrier wandered down the basement stairs. His name was Lou Farley. His real name was Feingold, but like many dreamers in that era, he had changed it. Farley loved music, especially harmony. When he heard the boys singing, he stopped and asked them to sing again. As they sang, they noticed a small crowd gathering at the top of the stairs. People were smiling. A few even tossed down pennies. That was the moment everything clicked. Burns later remembered turning to the other boys and announcing that the chocolate syrup business was officially over. From now on, they were in show business. The boys called themselves the Pee Wee Quartet. They performed anywhere that would tolerate them. Ferry boats, street corners, saloons, even brothels. They placed their hats on the ground and sang for donations. Sometimes customers dropped coins into the hat. Sometimes they took coins out. And sometimes, Burns joked later, they simply took the hat itself. But the seed had been planted. Entertainment was no longer just something fun to pass the time. It was a path. One of Burns's earliest steady jobs came backstage at a vaudeville and Nickelodeon theater run by Frank Sidon. Burns wasn't performing yet. He was operating the curtains. But from that position, he watched everything. Every gesture, every punchline, every moment when the audience laughed or went silent. By the time he was 14, he had picked up another habit that would become part of his signature image for the rest of his life. That was when George Burns started smoking cigars. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Burns was drafted into the Army. but the military quickly discovered something that ended his service before it began. He was extremely nearsighted and failed the physical examination. Instead of going to war, he returned to the only world he really understood: the stage. Somewhere along the way, Nathan Birnbaum became George Burns. At the time, many performers with Jewish backgrounds adopted stage names to avoid discrimination. Burns later explained that he chose George Burns partly because two professional baseball players already had that name, both successful hitters with more than 2,000 hits in the major leagues. If the name worked for them, he figured it might work for him too. He also borrowed George from his brother Izzy, who had adopted the name earlier simply because he disliked his own. And Burns, according to one of Burns' stories, came from the Burns Brothers Coal Company, from whose trucks he had once stolen coal as a kid. By the 1920s, Burns had become a regular in the chaotic world of vaudeville. He was a song and dance performer who constantly rotated partners. Sometimes he performed with trained animals. At one point, his partner was even a trained seal. Vaudeville was unpredictable, but it was also where the next generation of entertainment legends crossed paths. Burns shared stages with performers who would soon become giants of American entertainment: Jack Benny, Milton Berle, the Marx Brothers, George Jessel, Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, Jimmy Durante, Bob Hope. At the time, they were all just performers trying to land the next booking. But professionally, something still wasn't quite clicking for Burns. He had talent and timing, yet none of his partnerships truly worked. Some involved dance routines, others relied on comic banter. The chemistry simply wasn't there. Then, in 1923, everything changed. That was the year George Burns met Gracie Allen. Allen was a young Irish Catholic performer who had been singing and dancing with her sisters before stepping out on her own. From the moment they began working together, something about the pairing felt different. Burns handled the writing. Allen delivered the lines with a brilliantly confused innocence that audiences instantly loved. Together, they began developing the act that would make them famous. Burns had only a fourth-grade education, but he wrote all of their comic material himself. Line by line, routine by routine, he built the rhythm of their act. And it worked. Their strange, playful dynamic became one of the most recognizable comedy styles in the country. Off stage, their partnership deepened into something even more permanent. Gracie Allen became George Burns' life partner. Despite their religious differences, the two married in Cleveland, Ohio in 1926, with their close friend Jack Benny standing beside them as best man. In private, their relationship carried the same warmth audiences saw on stage. She called him Natty. He called her Googie. Together, they built not only a career, but also a family. In 1934, they adopted a daughter, Sandra. A year later, in 1935, they adopted a son, Ronald. The adoptions were arranged through a Catholic agency that required the children be raised in that faith. Burns agreed. Even so, he never abandoned his identity. Though he wasn't strictly observant as an adult, he never renounced his Jewish heritage. And when people asked why he never legally changed his name to George Burns, his answer was simple. He had been born Jewish, and he intended to die Jewish. George Burns and Gracie Allen, the love story behind America's funniest duo. If George Burns became a legend, it's impossible to tell that story without Gracie Allen standing right beside him. Together, George Burns and Gracie Allen were comedy gold. From the 1920s through the 1950s, they built an act unlike anything audiences had seen before. It wasn't just jokes and punchlines. It was a husband and wife turning the odd little moments of everyday life into comedy. George played the straight man, calm and steady, while Gracie delivered lines with a kind of logic that made no sense and yet somehow made perfect comedy. Her questions wandered in unexpected directions, and George's reactions carried the audience along for the ride. But the magic people saw on stage didn't appear overnight. Gracie Allen had been performing since she was young, dancing in shows around San Francisco before joining a vaudeville act with her sisters. By the time she crossed paths with George Burns, she already knew how to command a stage. The two met backstage in Union Hill, New Jersey. At first, the plan was simple. George would be the comic delivering the punchlines while Gracie would support the act. But once they stepped in front of an audience, something surprising happened. People weren't laughing at George's jokes. They were laughing at Gracie. Her innocent questions, the strange paths her thoughts took, and the way she misunderstood everything in the most entertaining way possible landed harder than anything George had planned. He recognized the moment immediately. Instead of fighting it, he stepped back and let her shine. That decision changed everything. From that point forward, the act revolved around Gracie's wonderfully confusing logic, while George stood beside her, grounding the chaos with his dry reactions. The balance between them became their signature, and audiences couldn't get enough. By the 1930s, Burns and Allen had moved far beyond the vaudeville stage. They stepped into film, conquered radio, and eventually found their way to television. In 1931, they signed a unique contract with Paramount Studios that allowed them to appear in short films while also touring the public's theater circuit. Their popularity only grew. Radio, however, was where their strange little world truly flourished. Gracie's scatterbrained character became a sensation with listeners, and George's steady narration made it even funnier. When the George Burns and Gracie Allen show launched on CBS in the early 1950s, they were already household names. What made them special wasn't just the material, it was how much of it felt real. George often explained that living with Gracie was just as unpredictable as performing with her. In 1936, he described a typical day with her as anything but ordinary. Moments from their home life often slipped straight into their act because that was simply how Gracie's mind worked. Sometimes it meant finding something bizarre, like a shaving brush sitting in the middle of his omelet. Other times it meant sorting through fan mail from confused shopkeepers who weren't quite sure whether Gracie was joking or serious. George's role was to stand there calmly and narrate the chaos. Even their rehearsal style added to the magic. Gracie never practiced their material with George at home. She preferred saving the lines for the stage or the studio, which meant every performance felt fresh and unpredictable. George later admitted that Gracie carried the heavier workload. Her lines twisted through complicated logic that made them difficult to memorize. In a typical 40-page script, George estimated that 30 pages belonged to Gracie, but she delivered them flawlessly. Their routines often revolved around Gracie's eccentric relatives, strange misunderstandings, and conversations that spiraled into hilarious confusion. And every show ended the same way, with a moment audiences came to expect. George would turn to her and say, "Say goodnight, Gracie," and she would answer simply, "Good night, Gracie." It was a small moment, but it became one of the most recognizable sign-offs in entertainment. Behind the laughter, though, their story was also about loyalty. George and Gracie worked side by side for nearly 40 years, through the rise of radio and into the golden age of television. They built a career together step by step. In the late 1950s, Gracie stepped away from performing because of health problems. George continued working, but he often admitted the stage never quite felt the same without her. The rhythm they had built together couldn't be recreated. When Gracie Allen passed away in 1964, George never remarried. Even decades later, he still spoke about her with affection. There was one story, however, that George didn't reveal until much later. 8 years before his own death, Burns admitted publicly that during their marriage, sometime in the 1950s, he had once cheated on Gracie. It was a one-night affair that he regretted almost immediately. His guilt showed up in the form of gifts. George bought Gracie a $10,000 diamond ring and a silver centerpiece worth $750. At the time, he believed he had successfully covered up what happened. What he didn't know was that Gracie had already figured it out. She never confronted him. The two never discussed it, and George lived for years believing the secret had stayed hidden. But for all the popularity and success, George's career would soon come dangerously close to collapsing because of a scandal. The smuggling scandal that almost destroyed George Burns' career. By the late 1930s, George Burns was riding high. His comedy career with Gracie was growing fast. Radio audiences loved them, and Hollywood doors were opening. But in 1938, something unexpected threatened to bring all of it crashing down. George Burns suddenly found himself caught in the middle of a federal smuggling scandal. The case centered on a man named Albert N. Chaparro, a smooth-talking operator who had been secretly bringing expensive jewelry into the United States without paying customs duties. Chaparro had a simple strategy. He moved through wealthy circles, selling the jewelry to people who either didn't ask questions or simply trusted his story. And many of those buyers were celebrities. As investigators began digging deeper, the names attached to the case started raising eyebrows across Hollywood and New York. Several well-known figures were questioned, including Sophie Tucker, Katharine Hepburn, and singer Kenny Baker. But two names quickly stood out above the rest: George Burns and Jack Benny. According to federal prosecutors, Burns had purchased 2 bracelets and a ring from Chaparro. The jewelry was valued at $4,885, a serious amount of money at the time. Authorities claimed the items had been smuggled into the country illegally. Suddenly, the beloved radio comedian was facing a very real legal crisis. Burns was indicted on federal charges, and if the court chose to make an example of him, the consequences could have been devastating. The possible sentence included up to 18 years in prison and a fine of $45,000. For a man whose career depended on public goodwill, the scandal was dangerous territory. Burns quickly chose a path that would end the ordeal faster. He pleaded guilty, maintaining that he had not known the jewelry was smuggled when he bought it. According to his account, he believed he was simply purchasing expensive pieces from someone presenting himself as a legitimate dealer. Jack Benny, on the other hand, chose a different route. Benny pleaded not guilty and went to trial after being accused of purchasing $1,200 worth of smuggled jewelry for his wife, Mary Livingstone. The courtroom proceedings drew plenty of attention because both men were among the most recognizable entertainers in the country. In the end, the judge handed down penalties but stopped short of destroying their careers. George Burns was fined $8,000 and received a suspended sentence, meaning he avoided prison time as long as he stayed out of further trouble. Jack Benny was fined $10,000 and also received a suspended sentence. The mastermind behind the operation, Albert N. Chaparro, faced far harsher consequences. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison after investigators uncovered the full extent of his smuggling scheme. Later, after assisting authorities in prosecuting other jewelry smugglers, he was eventually pardoned by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Fortunately for Burns, the story didn't end there. His career survived the scandal. His partnership with Gracie continued to grow, and the audiences who loved them kept tuning in. But for a brief moment in 1938, the man who would eventually live to be 100 years old came dangerously close to seeing his future unravel long before the laughter was over. George Burns left his fortune to one person. You'll never guess who. By the time George Burns reached the end of his life, he had already done something almost no entertainer ever manages to do. He stayed relevant for nearly a century, from singing on street corners as a kid in New York to conquering vaudeville, radio, television, and film. Burns turned a lifetime of jokes into one of the longest careers in show business history. Then, on March 9, 1996, the curtain finally came down. George Burns passed away peacefully at 10 a.m. in his Beverly Hills home, just weeks after celebrating his 100th birthday. His manager, Irving Fine, confirmed there was no pain and no suffering. By his side was his son Ronnie, along with a nurse and a housekeeper. In typical Burns fashion, even his final months were filled with humor. When he was too weak to attend his own 100th birthday celebration in January, he released a statement that sounded exactly like George Burns. Instead of sentimentality, he joked that people were asking what you give a man who has been so blessed. Another 100 years? Or maybe a night with Sharon Stone? That was Burns. Even at 100, the punchline always came first. A fall in July of 1994 had finally slowed him down and forced him to step away from performing. But until then, he had still been on stage delivering perfectly timed one-liners about aging and the strange privilege of simply making it that far. He liked to joke that he was doing better with 18-year-old women at 98 than he had when he was 18. At his 98th birthday gala in Las Vegas, he delivered another classic Burns line. At 98 years old, he told the crowd it was nice to be there, because at 98, it was nice to be anywhere. That dry humor followed him through the later chapters of his career. In 1975, when Burns accepted the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in The Sunshine Boys, he joked that if you stayed in the business long enough, you eventually became new again. But the comeback to television almost never happened. In 1974, at 78 years old, Burns underwent open-heart surgery. When he asked his doctor what would happen if he skipped the operation, the answer was blunt: he would die. Burns joked that he had already tried dying once in Schenectady and didn't care to repeat the experience. That same year brought another shock. His best friend, comedian Jack Benny, passed away. Ironically, that loss changed Burns's career. The role of the aging vaudevillian in The Sunshine Boys had originally been intended for Benny. After his death, the part went to Burns instead. The performance won him an Oscar and launched a whole new chapter of his career. Even as the years piled up, Burns kept working. He recorded music albums, including I Wish I Was 18 Again, whose title track became a hit in 1981. He also wrote several books reflecting on his life and career. But no matter how much success came his way, there was one person he never stopped thinking about: Gracie. Even decades after her death in 1964, Burns carried her tiny wedding ring in his pocket wherever he went. Once a month, he visited her mausoleum just to sit and talk to her. He joked that he didn't tell her jokes anymore because she had already heard them all. When Burns died in 1996, his funeral was held 3 days later at the Wee Kirk of the Heather Church in Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in Glendale, California. He was buried wearing one of his tailor-made suits, with 3 of his favorite cigars tucked into the breast pocket. Over the course of his lifetime, Burns is estimated to have smoked nearly 300,000 cigars. But while fans were mourning the loss of a legend, another question quickly started circulating. What happened to George Burns's fortune? By the time he died, Burns had built an estate estimated at around $50 million. After decades in show business and smart investments, he had quietly accumulated a massive fortune. Many assumed the money would go directly to his 2 adopted children, Sandra and Ronald. But the truth was more complicated. Burns' final will revealed that most of his assets were not distributed directly through the will. Instead, the document transferred the remainder of his estate into something called the George Burns Living Trust, a system that directed how his fortune would ultimately be distributed. Even the house he had lived in for decades became part of that process. Burns had built his Beverly Hills home for $79,000, including a pool and a pool house. After his death, the property sold for more than $2 million. Do you think any of Burns's fortune went directly to his children? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the ENX video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.